let's talk about morality. In particular, let's talk about whether objective morality exists. Most theists would argue that it does, and that it comes from God. As an atheist, I see no value in this argument. If they could actually establish that their God exists, and that he asserts moral obligations on us, then I would take it more seriously. But until then, we must look elsewhere for our morality. But what do I actually mean when I say objective morality? Good question. Here I mean objective in the same sense that we talk about an objective reality. That is, if there is an objective reality, as most of us believe, then facts about this reality do not depend on who is observing it. So two people making the same observations should get the same results, as reality exists independently of the observer. In practice, this is somewhat more complex, but the basic idea is straightforward. In the same way, an objective morality means that morality doesn't depend on the particular participants. So if murder is objectively wrong, then it would be wrong regardless of who's doing it. This doesn't mean that we ignore context, just that two people doing the same thing in the same context will be subject to the same morality. This is the same with objective reality. Just because the gravity on the moon is different to the gravity on the Earth doesn't mean that gravity doesn't objectively exist. So we can take context into account without losing objectivity. This complicates the practical application of morality, but doesn't, in principle, lead to subjective morality. Now, this definition of objective morality doesn't actually capture all of what we want in a decent moral system. To see why, consider the moral rule that what is morally good is just whatever the majority says so. This is actually an example of objective morality, as it depends only on the situation we find ourselves in, not on our subjective state. So two people in the same context will always come to the same judgment of what is moral. Obviously, this is unsatisfactory. The other thing we want is a rational morality. That is, one that is based solely on reason and evidence. As long as we accept that the laws of logic and that reality itself are objectively true, then any morality based on these will also be objective. So, whereas I would be unable to mount a rational argument for why the majority consensus should be accepted as moral, a rational objective morality should be accepted by all reasonable people. The problem with this is that many people think that such a morality simply doesn't exist. And this is based mainly on what is known as the is-ought problem, or the fact-value divide. The basic idea is that one cannot deduce what is morally good or bad simply from how the world actually is. That is, there are no facts of reality that can be appealed to in support of a moral truth. This is sometimes known as Hume's guillotine, as it was most famously formulated by David Hume. Hume's assertion was that any logical argument that only has factual premises cannot have an evaluative conclusion. So, if we start with statements about the way the world is, we cannot derive a statement about how the world should be. There is some contention as to whether this is quite the hard and fast rule that it appears to be, but I'm unaware of any objections that ultimately lead to any objectively true moral facts about the world. What I mean by this is that what we ultimately want to discover is an objectively true fact about the world that has moral value. This is important, as once we have a firm foundation, we can logically derive a rational, objective moral system from it. For example, if we could establish that unnecessary suffering was objectively morally wrong, then we can use this as a premise to derive further moral truths. For instance, unnecessary suffering is wrong, euthanasia prevents unnecessary suffering, therefore euthanasia is morally good. This argument doesn't fall foul of Hume's guillotine, as the first premise is a statement about morality. There have been quite a few attempts to discover objectively true moral facts, but to my knowledge they all fail. The currently popular one is the idea that human flourishing is good, or something similar. This is promoted by most people who seek a science-based, non-theistic morality. The problem is that it cannot be rationally established as actually true that human flourishing is necessarily good. There are two main attempts that are made to justify this assertion. Firstly, it's often argued that humanity has evolved to hold this as a fundamental ethical stance. This is most likely true, and much of our moral foundations almost certainly have an evolutionary basis. People and societies that held certain values, like cooperation, survival, and success, probably outcompeted individuals and societies that held other values. This is a very good explanation for our shared morality, and demolishes the apologist's argument that common morality is evidence for the existence of a God. But it does nothing to actually establish these values as good. To argue that the values we have evolved to have are necessarily the right ones is to commit the appeal to nature fallacy. It also leads to contradictions, as we also know that there are plenty of evolved human behaviours and values that are contradictory. So we have evolved to have altruistic drives, but also to have selfish drives, to cooperate and to compete, to help each other and to hurt each other. These contradictions mean that we can't have a rational morality based only on our evolved values. To select only some of these drives is to commit special pleading. The other way that people defend the idea that human flourishing should be the standard for goodness is by appealing to one common usage of the word good. In most societies, the concept of moral goodness is conflated with human flourishing, and in many contexts it is reasonable to assume that they are the same. But it misses the point of the philosophical discussion, which is to question whether it is rational to conflate the two. Suppose that in most societies the word good had come to mean the flourishing of rich white men only. Should we simply accept this definition? Especially since the concept of goodness does actually have a broader meaning of what is morally acceptable or praiseworthy, rather than just the particular conclusion that most of us has come to. Alternatively, if we do accept this common definition of what is good, then we still need to answer the question of should we do that which is good? To see the depth of the problem, consider a perfectly rational, amoral psychopath. This person will accept any rational argument, but is unswayed by any irrational appeal. Can you convince this person that, say, human flourishing is a goal that they should have? You might be tempted to appeal to their assumed self-interest, or to the harms of antisocial behaviour, but such a person would rightly reject these as appeals to consequence. You might try to convince them that morality is about the consequences of our actions, but you would have to actually justify this, and there is little philosophical consensus that consequentialism or utilitarianism are the only rational moralities. The bottom line is that the only way to convince this person is to appeal to some value that they already hold. There seems to be no way to convince them that any particular moral value should be accepted based only on logic. What this means is that an objective, rational morality simply isn't possible. All rational attempts at an objective morality rest upon axioms or foundations that cannot be rationally justified. This might seem like bad news for those of us who like the idea of a rational, objective morality, but in reality, it isn't really a problem. This is because almost all of us do have common values. The way that we've evolved, and the necessity of living in societies, has ensured that almost everyone values human flourishing and the survival of the human race. Even though some people don't have these values, we almost all have a strong sense of self-preservation and fairness. This is sufficient for grounding a rational, objective morality. In fact, many advances in morality that we have collectively made have not actually been significant shifts in our morals, but rather improvements in how we implement these morals. For example, historically, people have attempted to justify slavery by arguing that either slaves aren't really people, or that they don't really suffer. This is an implicit acknowledgement that human suffering is bad, which is still the mainstream basis for much of our morality. So the abolition of slavery was not based on a significant shift in our basic values, but rather on an improvement in our application of these values, or perhaps an improvement in the consistency with which we apply our values. Similarly, progress on women's rights, civil rights for black people, and LGBT rights are generally actually improvements in the consistency with which we apply our long-accepted values. Even the people who are strongly against treating people equally generally still agree that what advances the human condition and reduces suffering is morally right. They just use a faulty understanding of the world to argue that, say, allowing gay marriage would actually hurt people. Rarely, if ever, has an opponent of marriage equality explicitly stated that although legalizing it would actually reduce human suffering, they are still against it. It's always at least implied that they are interested in human well-being, even if it is just trying to help others avoid imaginary hellfire. Obviously, the reasons why people oppose such social progress are complex, and I don't mean to imply that I have the one answer to all of them. What I am arguing is that the value of human well-being is as close to a universal value as you will find. Even those political movements that have resulted in the most extreme deprivations were predicated on an attempt to improve the lives of people. They needed to do this in order to obtain mainstream support, as no significant majority of people would support a movement that was not, at least ostensibly, attempting to increase human well-being. So despite a rational objective morality having to be founded on assumptions that themselves cannot be rationally justified, this is only a theoretical problem of interest to philosophers. In reality, the vast majority of people subscribe, for ultimately irrational reasons, to the moral desirability of human well-being. So, in practice, a universal rational morality is possible, and that's what most secular humanists advocate. I hope you've enjoyed this video. See you next time.